Conform de gebruiken aan deze universiteit open ik deze academische plechtigheid met de volgende woorden. Spiritus Sancti gratia illuminet sensus et corda nostra. Amen. Gaat u zitten. Geachte aanwezigen, geachte collega's van hier en van verder, geachte familie van professor Verberk en zijn vrienden, geachte professor Verberk, and also dear international colleagues from abroad and dear online attendees. Mijn naam is José Sanders en als rector van de Radboud Universiteit en als voorzitter van deze academische zitting, die ook heel feestelijk is, zie ik, mag ik u allen van harte welkom heten hier aan onze universiteit in het academiegebouw in de aula. Vandaag aanvaardt professor Verberk de leeropdracht Functional Ecology aan de faculteit der Natuurwetenschappen, Wiskunde en Informatica. Professor Verberk is geboren in 1976 in Oplo, Noord-Brabant, en studeerde biologie hier aan de universiteit, aan de Radboud Universiteit. En hij promoveerde in 2008 op onderzoek naar de effecten van herstelmaatregelen in een hoogveenlandschap op het onderwaterleven. Na zijn promotie ontving hij een NWO Rubicon-beurs voor postdoctoraal onderzoek in het Verenigd Koninkrijk. En in 2012 keerde hij terug naar de Radboud Universiteit in de functie van universitair docent. En per 1 september van het afgelopen jaar is professor Verberk benoemd tot hoogleraar. Zijn onderzoek laat zien hoe dieren omgaan met veranderingen in temperatuur en zuurstof om te verklaren waarom soorten leven waar ze leven. Met dit onderzoek onderzoekt hij de universele principes of de levensregels die voor alle soorten gelden. En het is met grote interesse dat wij gaan luisteren naar de oratie van professor Verberk, getiteld Solving the Equations of Life, oftewel, voor de leek, hoe het leven werkt. En hij zal zijn reden in het Engels uitspreken. The floor is yours.
Yes. Ja, welkom ook namens mij allemaal. Het is niet elke dag dat je voor een zaal staat waar je iedereen kent en iedereen vriendelijk naar je lacht. But I'll continue in English. And the idea of today is to tell you a little bit about the research I've done. But I also realize many of you do not go to the university on a day-to-day basis. These lectures tend to be a lot about research, but at the university we also do education. So, rather than telling you about education, I thought about showing you. So the lecture will be giving you a flavor of what it is to be in university, listening to a lecturer. Some of these things might be maybe a bit tricky. That's okay. I'll pick you up along the way. Koos is here my help. He will give me a sign if things get too difficult, so I'll slow my pace. So we'll have a safeguard there. And any good lecture should start with learning objectives. So, the learning objective is at least to gain a better understanding. So some of you already know really well how science works, but it can be improved probably, of how science works. Some basic principles of life, because that's what you all came for. Hoe werkt het leven? I would be disappointed if you leave here without having heard at least one new thing. So it's a big challenge. And of course to have a bit of fun along the way. Okay, so to get this show on the road, so I'm working in the Faculty of Science. And it's not just biologists there who study zebrafish, there's lots of other biologists as well. But we also have mathematicians. We have people who study black holes. They can even take pictures of something that swallows all the light. Amazing. We have people who look at structural equations, causal modeling, chemists. And all of those fields you can arrange in certain ways. And to illustrate the talk, I thought let's arrange them. And this is what I found on the internet. So here we have fields arranged along one dimension. This is the dimension of purity. And you can see that the chemists might think that biology is just applied chemistry. The physicists might think that chemistry is just applied chemistry. And then, of course, we have the mathematicians who are way above everybody else. So in our building, sadly, we do not have psychologists. So we, as biologists, are at the bottom of the food chain. But I can honestly say that I did marry out of my league by marrying Lies, who is a mathematician. But more serious, so what I try to do is bridge the gap between biologists who study life and mathematicians who work with equations, because I think all of these fields have ways of inspiring one another. So, on to the first protagonist, or the main character of the story. There will be three main characters, so I'm not sure if main character is the right word. And this is the principle of useful approximations. I discussed this with Toon, who studies physics. He gave me some valuable advice, saying I just should not do this. And Toon, I hear your advice. I appreciate it, but I'm gonna ignore it anyway. So temperature. What is temperature? So we all might think that the room temperature here is maybe 20 degrees, 20 point something. Might increase a little bit during the lecture. And we can express temperature as for example, in the ideal gas law, where the volume times the pressure is a constant, and in that constant there is the temperature hidden. But actually the temperature is the kinetic energy of individual molecules. So what we're actually sensing is the integrated effect of all those molecules moving around in this space. So if we think about temperature, it's just a useful approximation of all that information. And this is something, a principle that we can use. We don't need to know everything perfectly. Even with imperfect knowledge or a useful approximation, we can derive something that works quite well. For example, we all have refrigerators, and they work from the ideal gas law, but they don't measure the position and the speed of every gas molecule. So we can get something workable in that way. So, my next slide is, why is temperature so important? So you already saw some of these animals, so I could probably spend 45 minutes talking about each of those pictures. But temperature is important because, here's a fun fact, and that is the vast majority of life is cold-blooded. So more than 99% of life, if you express that in number of species, biomass, numbers, is all cold-blooded. We scientists say ectotherms, but it really is cold-blooded. And what that means is that if you increase the temperature, the energy metabolism of all these animals increases in this fashion. So it's increasing exponentially. And this is something very different from our experience. So if we are in a room where the temperature is higher or colder, it doesn't really affect us so much. But for all these cold-blooded animals, well, you can see if the temperature goes up, metabolism goes through the roof. And as scientists, we like to describe these patterns, and we use mathematics for that. Because, it's really difficult if there's things that are non-linear. Because how would you describe this? Well, it increases with temperature, but that is not really doing justice to what is happening. So, the rate at which it increases actually increases as well. So to deal with non-linearity, there's different ways. One of them is the Q10 approach. And basically, you divide rate 2 against rate 1 and then raise it to some power. And this is a fairly simple formula. Guys, am I doing okay? Yeah? Good. The key point here is that the Q10 in most biological systems tends to be around 2. So that means that if the temperature is increasing by 10 degrees, there's a twofold increase, so rates double. So if you want to predict how fast your yogurt will spoil if you don't put it in a refrigerator, you can work out with a Q10 of 2 quite reasonable what will happen. So just to test your knowledge, if you actually understood what this means. So for 10 degrees, it's easy. Yeah? So Q10 of 2, 10 degrees warmer, doubling. So 100% increase. So what would the increase be if there's not a 10-degree increase, but only a 5-degree increase? Would it be 33%? Would it be 41%? Would it be 50%? So let's just raise hands to have a little bit of interaction. So who thinks A? Okay, about 25%. Who thinks B? I see a pattern there, not so many. Who thinks C? Okay, so I have something to do. So the good answer is B. Well done, everybody. And of course, those who know the answer, it's a multiplication. So after 5 degrees, you have the square root of 2 multiplied, because the square root squared will be 2, right? And the square root of 2, everybody knows this, is 1.414. Okay, so now everybody is engaged and fully compliant with this principle. But what you will see, of course, is if this rate is increasing at such a fast rate, something will go wrong, right? And this is what happens. So if you measure this in a real animal, so for example, in this beautiful larvae of a damselfly, you will see that at some point it will hit the ceiling and it cannot extract more and more oxygen from the water. And if you do it in another species, oh yeah, this is the adult, by the way, it looks also very nice. If you do it in another species, you will see these differences. So this is work that I did together with Hein from the Stichting Bargeveen. And we could actually use some of these measurements to see which dragonflies are decreasing and increasing in the Netherlands. And we found out that some of these species are actually suffering from a lack of oxygen at these higher temperatures that we're currently seeing more and more in the Netherlands. So we can actually link the thermal physiology, so what these animals are doing in the lab, to some of these patterns that we are seeing in the field. So this is good. So we know how it works for at least these two species. But we have another fun fact, and that is that there are over 10 million species on our planet. And so we need a way to solve this. So part of this lecture as a new professor is that you highlight like a vision or a grand idea. So here it is. Can we arrange species according to their biology? So perhaps drawing from another discipline within the science building, the ecological periodic table. So most of you will know the periodic table. Who has never seen this before? So a few people. You will get it in high school. This is all the elements that are known on Earth and how they are arranged. And we already see, rather than one dimension that we had with all the fields, now we already have 2 dimensions. So we have all the elements arranged in a certain table. We can see all the noble gases, all the edelgassen, all the way in white on the right. And they are arranged by the mass, but also by how many electrons are in their electron configuration. So if you just focus on this row, you can already see that neon is the noble gas, then fluor, oxygen, nitrogen, and they differ in how many electrons are there. And that is maybe important, maybe not, but it does tell you a lot about their properties. So the neon is perfectly happy. It has enough electrons, doesn't really react to anything. Fluor is, it's basically a wannabe. They want to be a noble gas, but they lack an electron. So they're really voracious to have more electrons. And we actually use this, right? Every day we brush our teeth using fluoride because it's so reactive and it kills off all the pathogens. Now, oxygen is actually only one step further. So it's also somewhat reactive, but not super reactive. So it's enough that we can actually have oxygen building up in the atmosphere without it reacting all the way again. So let's focus a bit on oxygen, because this is actually our second protagonist, so the second main character. Oxygen. It's a gas with 2 molecules. It's about 21% in the atmosphere at the moment. And of course, we all know this. We use oxygen to burn the food that we have. So this is carbohydrates, so carbon, C and H. And we do that because we get lots of energy from that. So this is the fire or the light, and we have some waste products like CO2 and water. Okay. And we tend to think of this as a good thing, obviously. So it has been likened also to the Force in Star Wars. So in Star Wars, we all know Star Wars probably, yeah? You have the Force, the living energy that permeates all of life, that makes everything possible. And in the movies, they actually say it's because of the midichlorians. Now, in our bodies, we have mitochondria, and that is actually the site where oxygen is being used to produce this energy. So there is a nice reference from Star Wars to the mitochondria. Interestingly enough, within the mitochondria, the energy is produced by a proton motive force. So it goes both ways. Okay. And we are very used to having enough oxygen, 21%, as I said. But this wasn't always the case. So if we look into the literature, and this is cool that science can do this, right? So we can actually look back in the past how much oxygen there was in the atmosphere. So this is when we are now. This is here, presently. This is the start of the planet, about 4,000 million years ago. So that's in English a billion, in Dutch it's miljard, 4 miljard. 4 billion years ago, That's when the Earth started. And as you can see, well, nothing really happened for a long time. And then we had oxygen. But this is not the whole story. And that is because a lot of things are happening in just the lower part of the graph. And here I will try to explain a little bit of a leap of faith, because I'm going to plot the same data, and now you see a whole different pattern. So the only thing that has changed now is the y-axis. So we had a y-axis that is just additive, and in the lower graph we have a y-axis that is log 10 transformed. So the key difference there is in the graph above you just add things up, and in the graph below you multiply. So every step is a multiplication of a factor 10. And so you can see that there's a lot happening below 1% oxygen that we didn't see in the graph that was shown above. And we can actually highlight some key events here. So here we have the onset of photosynthesis. So at this point, the bacteria, they found a way to break apart water and use that for photosynthesis. So the oxygen in our air is actually a waste product derived from breaking up water. And you can see that that raised oxygen a little bit, but a lot of the oxygen was then again used in other processes because it's still quite reactive. And only after all of those things were oxidized did oxygen actually start to accumulate. Interestingly enough, this is the Cambrian explosion. So basically all of, well, I would say interesting life, but we have microbiologists here as well, but all of the eukaryotic life that we know and cherish today has actually started from the Cambrian explosion. And you can see, give or take a few million years, that correlates very nicely when oxygen levels rose. We also have these enigmatic dragonflies, or griffinflies actually, so these were the Protodonata, and they could reach wingspans of this size, so 70 centimeters. And they were found only during this peak in oxygen that you see on the upper graph. And then, maybe not so nice, but when the oxygen levels plummeted, we had mass extinction events. And this mass extinction event is termed the Great Dying, and that was caused by oxygen levels falling again and wiping out 90% of life on the oceans and 70% of life on land. So, fun fact, or at least fact, oxygen, if we even take a very long-term perspective, is linked to very key events in the evolution of life. Now, I don't want to spoil too much about Star Wars, but Anakin is actually Darth Vader. But oxygen also has a dark side. Because oxygen, we use that to generate energy, which we think is good. But if sometimes the oxygen only gets a single electron, and then they become like fluoride. They will become very aggressive and they want to react with anything. And that is what actually damaging our DNA, and it's causing us to age and grow old and eventually die. So oxygen is linked to key events in life, including death. And this is maybe not so much as a fun fact, but at least it's very functional. Hence the title of my chair. And that is because this is a nice principle in the sense that as scientists, we can actually use this because if there's like a good side and a bad side, it means that there has to be a choice. So life is a balancing act. And this is why we have a whole cascade of oxygen. So we have the mitochondria that require this oxygen, and we have a lot of systems in place that actually feed oxygen to the mitochondria, but not too much and not too little. So it has to be balanced just right. That is, of course, also why we have hemoglobin, why we have blood cells, why we have a heart that can beat faster or not. If oxygen was only good, then we would just flood the cells with oxygen. We have lots of energy, but oxygen also has this dark side. Okay, so we have already derived two useful principles, so that's good. We still want to arrange these species into our ecological periodic table, but we need a third key player, and that is the body size. or size at least. So here we see a nice illustration, and size is great, right? It's great to be large. I'm 1.98 meters. So I might be a bit prejudiced, but you can already see the advantages, right? If you're the biggest fish, you're not going to be eaten. Larger animals tend to produce more babies. They tend to be better in competitions. However, if you look at body size, then most species are small. If you take all the bird species, you have the smallest and the largest. You take in the middle, most species are in the smaller part. Same is true for mammals, insects, whatever. Most groups have smaller organisms. So again, a question. Why is this? So I have three options again. Growth takes more time. Growth takes resources, or C, it's lonely at the top. So, am I doing okay, Coach? Yeah?
The third question is fun.
Yeah, you don't think it's the third one? Okay, so who thinks it's A? Okay, 4, yeah? And that is actually true. Growth takes time. And it allows mortality to accumulate. So it doesn't always pay off to be the largest. Who thought it was B? Also true. It also takes resources, right? And that requires animals to risk going out, exposing themselves to danger, foraging. So yeah, it's that. Who thought it was C? Also right. Because if you have the base of the food chain, and there's always energy loss. So if you're the top predator, there's not that much energy to build large populations, and small populations are going more likely to go extinct. So all of these reasons contribute to this pattern that we are actually seeing. So for size, this is also true. Size is also a balancing act. So you can be large, but you have all these disadvantages, and you have some advantages. And so a lot of biologists study size or growth because it's such a great indicator. It really shows what the species evolutionary was selected for to do. If they grow to be small and they die quickly, then they probably have a different set of living conditions than the larger species. So size is a great integrator. I should point out here that it's not just the body size that is important, but also the cells that make up the body. And again, there we have this balancing act. So if you have large cells, they tend to be very much geared towards energy conservation. So basically the energy A+++ label. Whereas if you have small cells, then they are more likely to take up enough resources and have this wasteful energy life cycle. So we actually see patterns in cell size related to their ecological niche. Okay, so we already saw the effects of temperature on oxygen consumption or energy metabolism. And we can do the same thing for mass. And the null hypothesis might be, well, if the animal is larger, they will require more oxygen. So that makes a lot of sense. And if we do a log-log plot, we are basically looking at the exponent. So then the null hypothesis would be that it scales isometrically. So the exponent would be 1. However, this is not what we see. So here we have actual data. Data on endotherms in red, so warm-blooded animals, the animals that are just less than 1% of all living animals. And we have the cold-blooded animals, so the ectotherms, which are the majority of life. And for both cases, you see this exponent is less than 1. And actually, this is significant. So it's statistically significant. So if you believe in p-values, some people do, this is a p-value of less than 0.0001. So it's super, super significant. And these are data from Craig White from Australia, and I analyzed them in a different way. But Craig will probably agree with this, this analysis as well. And this is, yeah, if you never thought about these things, you're like, okay, sure enough. But the fact that these are scaling exponents that are actually different, there have been whole conferences where you couldn't say this. It's basically like being at a meeting of Apple and Microsoft and then talking about privacy rights. You just don't say these things at those, at those meetings. Just to illustrate how this matters, so does it matter if it's 1 or 0.8 or... let's look at some of these things, because we can then express the amount of energy that you use in joules per day per gram. So we standardize things per gram. And if you just do it per gram, we humans, according to this calculation, we use about 100 joules per day. But my favorite beetle, Columbates spiculi, also uses 100 joules per day per gram, but it's a much smaller beetle, and so you end up at the same thing. And that is because if you draw the line of the scaling exponent being exactly 1, they're on the same line. So even though we are heavier, we tend to use less oxygen, but since we're warm-blooded, that compensates. But if we are log-log plots, why stop here, right? So we can just extrapolate way beyond that. And then we can even look at the sun. And we can put in the sun, and it exactly is on the line. When I plotted this, I was like, don't know why that is. Is that just coincidence? But as you might remember, the slope is less than 1. So if we then calculate the energy of the sun, it's only 0.016. So the fun fact here is that each of us will burn about 6,000 times more brightly than the sun on a per gram basis. A slightly more serious thing is that we really have to be careful in how we compare these things. Should we just express them per gram? Or are we then comparing apples and pears? Or are we introducing an artifact? So we need these scaling relationships in order to make comparisons and keep all else equal. Okay, so this is basically the idea. So we have useful approximations. We know life balancing some of these things. And in order to make decent comparisons, we have to keep things on a comparable basis. Okay, let's apply this to a nice problem that is integrating things. So we already saw body size being important and growth being a great integrator. Now we're actually going to combine that with temperature. And the funny thing is that if you grow animals under a warmer temperature, they grow faster, maybe not so surprisingly, but they stop growing. They stop growing at a smaller size. And so the whole life cycle is sped up, and they stop growing at a slightly smaller size. And you could say, well, this can be explained easily, right? So we know at higher temperatures they need more oxygen, and the larger animals need more oxygen. So if the temperatures are warmer, then of course they cannot grow to that same body size because they would need so much more oxygen. But this is not happening here, because if we take the derivative, so the slope of the line, we actually see that temperature has a stimulating effect initially because the animals grow faster, but then it inhibits growth later on. So we cannot just look at these linear effects. We have to think about a third three-way interaction. So we have to think about temperature increasing things, but only in the small animals, but not in the large animals. So that is basically one possible resolution to the temperature size rule. But this is all, yeah, you can derive that, you can predict that, but as scientists we then want to test that. So we know the pattern is there. If we rear these animals, they converge to these patterns of the temperature size rule. But if we want to explain that and say, oh yeah, but it's related to how quickly they can take up oxygen and how much oxygen they need, we need independent data and see if that actually is the case. And so this is an example of a study, the types of studies that you can do to do this. So we looked at fish of different sizes. We looked in the literature, We extracted all the data that we could find on how big they are, how much oxygen they need, and then we tried to analyze and see if we could find patterns that are consistent with the size patterns that I already showed. And to do that, we need mathematics, we need equations, because we are solving the equations of life. So these are all straightforward, right? Goes? Not so much. But we can see all our protagonists. So we see mass, we see temperature, we see oxygen. And basically what this does, without going into the details of the equation, we have equations saying how much oxygen an animal needs. We have equations detailing how much oxygen is available to the animals. And then the big innovation was that we said, let's equate them to one another. Because otherwise, if the animal is using more oxygen than it can extract, it's going to be depleted in oxygen and it's going to die. If an animal is extracting more oxygen than it needs, it's going to blow up because it will be filled with oxygen. So the assumption here is that these two rates should be balanced. And if you do that, you get a nice model that predicts this effect. So again, we see with increasing body mass, metabolism going up. We see with increasing temperature, the red lines, temperatures going up. But at this larger body size, the lines are getting closer and closer together. So the increase is less and less. And then these are the data. And the data qualitatively exactly show this pattern. And so we could actually see that indeed that there is evidence, independent evidence, that larger animals are also more likely to run out of oxygen at these warmer temperatures. And we found it actually much stronger for active animals, so they actually have to exercise and of course will run out of oxygen even sooner. Okay, so we then know some of these principles. We know that animals can grow larger if they are in the cold, if they have a lot of oxygen, and the reverse happens if things get warmer and if they have less oxygen. But since there are all these balances, we can also say that the trade-offs are at the heart of biology. And each trade-off can be, each balancing act can be described by an equation that governs these competing functions. So, an energy allocation between functions that are different. And then life is a collection of solutions to some of these equations, because there's not a single solution. So you could actually say we can solve the equations of life by looking at how each of those species solves this balancing act or multiple balancing acts. And if we know that for each species, we can then use that in our periodic table. So this is part 1 of the lecture. Let's go to part 2. So we already saw that there were 10 million species. Before you came in, you saw all the animals that I worked on. So each of you will probably have recognized a few of them, sometimes with warm memories, sometimes maybe with not so warm memories of having to measure all of these animals. And some of you might have thought, well, he did quite a lot of animals in the 25 years that he worked as a researcher. But even if I would broaden that and I would work for 1,000 years, then if all the biodiversity is that, the small point would be the section of biodiversity that I could actually work on. And if I spent 10,000 years, it's a slightly bigger circle, but still, if I spent 100,000 years, then I would cover that much part of the whole biodiversity. But if we want to solve this for all the species, it would take me as long as back as the Cambrian explosion, so the same amount of time that it took for all the species to evolve. So that is a lot of work, and frankly, we don't have the time, right? So this is the atmospheric oxygen levels, and we can see it going down. But look at the time scale. So we're actually going from 1990 to 2024. we see measurable declines in the atmospheric oxygen levels. Now, if I already mentioned the Great Dying, where oxygen levels have plummeted, this is, well, problematic. You can also see a trick of the scientists, so they always put, the graph doesn't start at 0, so we shouldn't be gasping for breath just now. But it is slightly worrying, and this is because we're burning up all the carbon that was stored long, long ago, and that's consuming all the oxygen. Well, not all the oxygen, but eventually there will be a problem. But I was told I shouldn't end on a pessimistic note. So we don't have enough time, but there are solutions to actually get all the knowledge that we need without going all the way to the Cambrian explosion. And that is, if we want to fit equations, we do not need full knowledge. So we already started with this principle. We just need a few dots. If we know it's a linear line, in principle, two points could do. And if we know the line goes through the origin, we could even get away with that. We could just say, well, we just need a single point. So that's hopeful. So we just need to have theory on how exactly is the shape of the line. That is slightly important, though. But we have good theoreticus, and we can do a lot. The other thing that we would probably need to do is not having me slave away for thousands of years. And I have to say, I did a lot, but I wasn't on my own. So, but we should join forces. And this is an initiative that I started with colleagues. It's called Share Trade, and we are actually trying to collect data in a big database on these key traits of animals. And yeah, when I explain this to people, I say, well, this is a database without a question. And that's very different from how people normally approach it. So with the fish example, for example, people have a question in mind and they extract the data exactly for their own question. But here we don't have a question in mind. We want to extract all the data, and then everybody can contribute to building that database. It makes data sharing an integral part of doing science. We don't have to duplicate efforts because another researcher might have the same idea and extract the same data, and it's just a waste of time. And we all work together to create this common resource. So those are my two solutions to solving the equations of life for 10 million species. Okay, so the acknowledgements. That's also a very important part. And I put this picture here of a wood because I already mentioned Koos, I already mentioned Toon, but Saar is doing philosophy. And of course, if we think about philosophy, we always think, okay, yeah, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound if there's nobody there to hear it? And I would say, well, maybe if I catch a nice animal in this stream, but there's nobody around, did I actually catch it? But you could also say, if you have a success and there's nobody there to celebrate it with you, is it really a success? And so, when I'm here and I see all of you, I feel it's a big success. So I would like to thank everybody, also the people online, thank you for making this a success. Now, there are also people who should have been here, but they aren't. So it's a bit sad, but my mother, with Toon, a long time ago, who was my biggest fan, I have to say, unconditional. My son, who was my smallest fan, I guess. And I also have to mention Hans Esslink, who was the director of Stichting Wageningen and really was shaping the start of my scientific career. And apparently I heard later on that he had this idea that I would become a professor at some point in the future. So I guess I proved him right. And it's always difficult to keep going after this. Because I don't believe in an afterlife. I can safely say this because it's no longer a Catholic university. So As a scientist, you always have to have a little bit of doubt. So I could be wrong, and in this case, I hope I am wrong, because if I am wrong, they are still somewhere. And I know for certain that if I'm wrong, and if they are somewhere, they will be seeing this as well from a distance. Hopefully with a better than Teams, but still. And so that is a nice idea for myself. Of course, I could thank a lot of people over the years, and I am very thankful, and I do that to all of you. But of course, there's one person in particular I would like to mention. So today we are married for 25 years and 25 days. I looked it up. So yeah, Lies, you started this journey with me some time ago, and I'm still very happy to have you as a companion along the way. Our fellowship expanded a little bit with some more travelers, and I also am very happy that I can be a part of your journey, Saatoon and Koos, and see how you take life to the next level and make life worth living. Dank je wel.
Professor Verberk, heel veel dank voor uw reden waarin u ons hebt meegenomen op een reis van miljoenen jaren, waarin u ons oproept om samen met u gegevens te onderzoeken, door samen te werken. We kunnen samen ballen in dat ene fantastische overzicht waar u naar streeft. Aan het begin zei u, we hebben een aantal leerdoelen. Ik heb er een paar opgeschreven. Voor mezelf ook, om te kijken of ik er iets van... Minstens 1 nieuw ding leren. Nou, wie heeft er minstens 1 nieuw ding geleerd? Ik denk 1000. Wat ik wel een hele mooie vond, die was niet echt nieuw, maar van ik denk, nou, die nemen we allemaal mee. Dat is Life is a Balancing Act. Ik denk dat we dat allemaal met u na kunnen zeggen. En ook een hele mooie vond ik dat mensen nog harder stralen als de zon. En ik denk dat u ook enkele mensen hebt aangewezen die stralen als sterren. En zo hebben we ook allemaal nog een levensles meegenomen uit dit hele mooie verhaal, waar we, denk ik, jaren mee verder kunnen. Heel veel dank dat u met deze prachtige reden uw leeropdracht hebt aanvaard. En we hebben veel om op na te kouwen. Ik stel voor dat wij een einde maken aan deze academische plechtigheid. We gaan zo dadelijk naar buiten. Eerst het cortège. Daarna bent u allen van harte welkom om mee naar beneden te gaan. En daar is taart, heb ik begrepen. Dus er wordt feest gevierd met muts en taart. Dus ik stel voor dat we nu allemaal gaan staan om dit mooie samen zijn af te ronden. En de traditie vraagt dat ik dat doe met de volgende woorden. Gratias tibi agimus omnipotens Deus pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum.